Imagine walking through the shadows of an ancient Greek temple at midnight, the air thick with the scent of burning herbs, the sound of whispered chants echoing off the stone walls. Around you, figures cloaked in secrecy move in unison, performing rituals so strange, so forbidden, that speaking of them aloud could mean exile or worse. This was the world of the mystery cults, shadowy brotherhoods and sisterhoods that operated in the heart of Greek society, yet existed just beyond the grasp of everyday understanding. Their practices were so closely guarded that even today, centuries later, much of what they did remains a tantalizing enigma. But what we do know is this: these cults were the keepers of secrets that promised power, enlightenment, and even a glimpse into the afterlife. And some of those secrets were downright bizarre. From the outside, ancient Greece might seem like a world of logic and reason, home to philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, whose ideas still shape our thinking today. But beneath that polished surface thrived a hidden undercurrent of mysticism, where initiates underwent bizarre trials, drank hallucinogenic brews, and enacted sacred dramas so intense they left participants forever changed. These weren't just fringe groups, they were central to the spiritual lives of countless Greeks, from humble farmers to powerful leaders. The Eleusinian mysteries, for example, were so revered that even Athenian statesmen like Pericles and Socrates were said to have participated. Yet, despite their influence, the details of their rituals were so fiercely protected that breaking their oath of silence was punishable by death. So what exactly went on in these secretive gatherings? That's what we're about to uncover. Over the course of this journey, we'll delve into 30 of the most astonishing, unsettling, and downright strange practices of these ancient mystery cults, rituals that range from the awe-inspiring to the utterly shocking. You'll hear about ceremonies involving sacred snakes, rituals performed in pitch darkness, and even claims of divine possession that blurred the line between human and God. Some of these practices might sound like scenes from a myth, but they were very real to those who lived them. And by the time we're done, you'll see ancient Greece in a whole new light, not just as the birthplace of democracy and philosophy, but as a world where mystery, magic, and the unknown held sway over the hearts and minds of its people. Ready to step into the shadows, let's begin. One of the most tantalizing secrets of the ancient Greek mystery cults lies in a single cup, a deceptively simple drink called Kykeon, consumed during the sacred rites of the Eleusinian mysteries. This wasn't just any beverage, it was a gateway, a sacred potion rumored to dissolve the boundary between the mortal world and the divine. Picture this: initiates, after days of fasting and ritual purification, finally gathered in the shadowy inner sanctum of Eleusis. A priest would hand them the Kykeon, and as they drank, the room would seem to ripple, walls breathing, torchlight twisting into visions of gods and underworld journeys. But what was in this enigmatic brew, and why was revealing its recipe punishable by death? Modern scholars believe Kykeon contained something far more potent than barley and water. The leading theory points to ergot, a fungus that grows on damp grain, known to produce compounds strikingly similar to LSD. When ingested, it could trigger profound hallucinations, visions of Persephone's descent into the underworld, of Demeter's grief, or even of the initiate's own symbolic death and rebirth. But this wasn't some haphazard drug trip, it was a carefully orchestrated spiritual experience. The effects were likely amplified by the cult's rituals, days of anticipation, sensory deprivation in pitch-black chambers, and the thrumming chants that would have guided the visions toward sacred revelation. The secrecy surrounding Kykeon wasn't just about preserving ritual exclusivity, it was about power. To know the ingredients was to hold the key to the mystery's transformative magic, and that knowledge was reserved for the highest initiates alone. Even famous figures like the philosopher Plato, who may have participated, never dared to write of it directly, the penalty for disclosure, execution, or exile. This absolute silence hints at something extraordinary. The Greeks believed Kykeon didn't just simulate divine encounters, it genuinely opened a door to the other side. And when you've tasted the nectar of the gods, some secrets are too dangerous to spill. Among the most peculiar objects venerated by the ancient Greeks was something we'd consider utterly ordinary, an egg. But for the Orphic cult, this fragile shell was no breakfast staple. It was the very symbol of the universe's creation, cradling the secrets of life, death, and rebirth. Picture initiates gathered in torchlit caves, clutching eggs painted with symbols of gods and constellations. Then, with a sudden crush of their hands, they'd shatter them against stone altars. This wasn't mindless destruction, it was a sacred act, a reenactment of the cosmic egg's rupture that, according to Orphic myth, birthed the first deity, Phanes, from the void. The ritual's power lay in its layers of meaning. Just as the egg's shell gave way to new life, so too did the initiate's act symbolize the breaking of their own cyclical suffering. The Orphics believed human souls were trapped in an endless loop of reincarnation, burdened by the ancient crime of the Titans who devoured the infant god Dionysius. By smashing the egg, they mimicked the liberation of their own souls, hoping to escape the wheel of rebirth and ascend to divine purity. Archaeological finds support this. Grave sites of Orphic devotees often contained gold tablets inscribed with instructions for navigating the afterlife, some buried alongside actual eggshell fragments, a tactile promise of resurrection. What makes this ritual especially fascinating is its contrast to mainstream Greek religion. While most Greeks focused on appeasing the Olympian gods, the Orphics turned inward, seeking personal salvation through secrecy and symbolism. Their eggs weren't just props, they were microcosms of the universe, their destruction a sacred dismantling of fate itself. Even today, echoes of this belief persist. Think of Easter eggs or the primordial egg myths found from India to Finland. The Orphics understood something primal, that within fragility lies the potential for transformation, and sometimes to begin anew, you must first break what came before. The worship of Dionysus wasn't for the faint of heart. While other gods demanded orderly sacrifices and prayer, Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and chaos, invited his followers into a world where rationality shattered like a dropped amphora. Imagine a moonlit forest clearing, the air thick with the scent of crushed grapes and sweat. Drums pounded like frantic heartbeats as women, known as maenads, swirled in delirious dances, their hair wild, their eyes glazed with something beyond mere intoxication. This was the Dionysian frenzy, a ritual so intense it blurred the line between human and divine, civilization and savagery. And at its climax came the act that would horrify any outsider, the sparagmos, where worshippers seized a live animal, a bull, a goat, even a deer, and with bare hands tore it limb from limb. This wasn't mindless violence, every gory detail held sacred meaning. The maenads believed Dionysus himself inhabited the animal, and by devouring its raw flesh in the omophagia, they consumed the god's essence, merging with him in a way no temple offering could achieve. The act was a rebellion against societal order, against the very boundaries that separated mortals from the divine. In that bloody feast, hierarchies dissolved. Slaves stood equal to nobles. Women, often sidelined in Greek society, became vessels of divine power, and the rigid structures of daily life crumbled like the bones between their teeth. But why such extreme symbolism? Dionysus was a god of contradictions, both life-giver and destroyer, patron of revelry and madness. His rituals forced participants to confront the primal forces beneath their polished Hellenic world. Philosophers like Euripides captured this duality in plays like the Bacchae, where characters who denied Dionysus' power were literally torn apart by their own kin, a warning against ignoring the wildness within. Even the choice of animals mattered. Bulls linked to fertility symbolized rebirth. Deer, sacred to Artemis, represented the overthrow of rival divinities. Every scream, every drop of blood was a prayer reminder that civilization was just a thin veneer over something far older, far darker, and far more alive. Archaeological evidence hints at how widespread these practices were. From Thrace to Crete, artifacts depict maenads gripping torn animal limbs, their faces twisted in ecstasy. Some scholars argue these rites may have roots in prehistoric shamanism, where consuming raw flesh was believed to transfer a creature's strength. But for the Greeks, the frenzy wasn't just about power, it was about liberation. In a society where women's lives were tightly controlled, the maenads' autonomy was revolutionary. Their rituals were spaces where the oppressed could, for one night, become the untamed hands of a god. Yet there was a price for this transcendence. Ancient sources describe participants waking hours later, miles from the ritual site, their clothes stained with blood and earth, no memory of how they got there. The frenzy didn't just mimic madness, it was madness carefully channeled. And that's what made it so terrifying to outsiders. To the uninitiated, these worshippers weren't holy, they were dangerous, a threat to the very fabric of society. Which, of course, was exactly the point. Dionysus didn't just want devotion, he demanded surrender. To know him was to lose yourself, to embrace the chaos that lurked beneath every vine, every heartbeat, every carefully constructed lie of order. While the Dionysian rites celebrated chaos, another secretive festival took a far more earthy, and by modern standards, unsettling approach to connecting with the divine. The Thesmophoria was Demeter's domain, a women-only event so sacred that men caught sneaking in could face execution. But what makes this festival truly strange wasn't just its exclusivity. It was the ritual use of piglets, tossed alive into underground chambers and left to rot. These weren't random acts of cruelty, they were part of a profound agricultural rite, one that blurred the lines between fertility, death, and rebirth in ways that would make even seasoned farmers pause. Picture this: months before the festival, women would select young piglets, animals sacred to Demeter for their fecundity. The creatures were then dropped into megara, deep pits or caves symbolizing the underworld, where they decomposed amidst snakes, symbols of regeneration. When the Thesmophoria began, the women would descend into those same pits to retrieve the decayed remains, now believed to be infused with chthonic power. Mixed with seeds before planting, this macabre compost was thought to guarantee abundant harvests. It was farming turned sacrament, a direct appeal to the cycle Demeter herself embodied when her daughter Persephone vanished underground each winter. But why pigs? Ancient sources hint at a myth so dark it rivals the Eleusinian mysteries. Some versions say that when Hades abducted Persephone, a swineherd named Eubuleus and his pigs were swallowed by the earth alongside her. The piglets in the megara thus became symbolic stand-ins for Persephone's descent, their decomposition mirroring her time in the underworld, their retrieval echoing her return. This wasn't just about crop yields, it was a reenactment of the primordial bargain between life and death. The festival's taboo-breaking nature went deeper than rotting pig flesh. For 3 days, Athenian women, normally confined to domestic roles, controlled the rites, mocking male authority in bawdy songs and temporarily overturning social hierarchies. The Thesmophoria wasn't merely a fertility ritual. It was a rare moment where women held the keys to the city's survival, their secret knowledge of birth and decay as vital as any general strategy. Even the piglet's fate carried a subversive edge. In a culture where men dominated public sacrifice, the women's act of discarding and reclaiming life from the earth asserted their own sacred agency. Archaeology confirms the strangeness. At sites like Priene, stone-lined megara have been found near Demeter's sanctuaries, some containing tiny pig bones. Vase paintings show women carrying piglets and baskets of decay, images that would have been incomprehensible to outsiders, as discussing the rites was forbidden. This secrecy wasn't just tradition, it was protection. In a world where men like Aristophanes joked about the Thesmophoria in plays, the true power of those pits, the raw, transformative stench of death becoming life remained a mystery only women could wield. When we reduce these rituals to shock value, we miss their brilliance. The thesmophoria wasn't about senseless brutality. It was about confronting the most visceral truths of existence. Rot nourishing growth, women's labor sustaining the state, the endless dance between the below and the above, these were mysteries as vital as any philosopher's lecture. And in that dark, reeking pit, ancient Greek women held the answer to a question their society rarely dared ask. What sustains us isn't just the clean, bright fruit of the harvest, but the messy, unseen transformations that make it possible. The cult of Cybele brought one of the most extreme displays of devotion the ancient world had ever witnessed, rites so visceral they made even battle-hardened Romans flinch. At the heart of this Phrygian mother goddess worship were her priests, the Galli, who in a single, bloody moment of ecstatic surrender, severed their own manhood to fully embody the myth of her doomed lover, Attis. Imagine the scene during the Day of Blood, the climax of the March festival, drums throbbing, flutes wailing, and devotees whirling in a dance that crescendoed into collective frenzy. Then, as the music reached its peak, new initiates' faces painted white, robes billowing would seize a ritual blade and, in front of the roaring crowd, castrate themselves in a spray of crimson, tossing their flesh onto Cybele's altar like sacred offerings. This wasn't mere shock theater. The act mirrored Attis' tragic story, where the youthful consort of Cybele, driven mad by her jealousy, mutilated himself under a pine tree and bled to death. By reenacting his fate, the Galli didn't just honor the goddess, they became Attis, merging with the divine through what they called the sanguinaria, the sacred bloodletting. Their sacrifice granted them a paradoxical status, outcasts and holy men in one, shaven-headed, draped in saffron robes and often wearing feminine jewelry. They lived as liminal figures, neither fully male nor female, singing through the streets for alms with their high, rasping voices, a walking testament to Cybele's power. Rome's relationship with Cybele's cult was deeply conflicted. Though the Senate invited her worship during the Second Punic War, believing her favor would save them from Hannibal, they quickly recoiled from the Galli's rites. Roman citizens were forbidden from joining their ranks. The idea of self-mutilation was anathema to a culture that prized discipline and bodily integrity. Yet the cult persisted, its foreignness only adding to its allure. Poets like Catullus wrote of Attis' agony with horrified fascination, and statues of the Galli, their faces frozen in ecstatic pain, dotted the empire's edges. Even the ban couldn't erase their impact. Underground sects continued the practice for centuries. What's often overlooked is the radical gender subtext of these rituals. In a world rigidly divided between masculine and feminine roles, the Galli's transformation, donning silk, growing their hair long, and living as celibate vessels of the goddess challenged every social norm. Some scholars argue their emasculation wasn't just religious theater but an early form of gender affirmation, a rejection of binary constraints. Temple artifacts support this. Votive offerings from Galli include terracotta genitals, left as pleas for healing or perhaps as symbols of their new identity. The psychological and physical risks were staggering. Ancient sources describe initiates bleeding to death or succumbing to infections. Yet those who survived spoke of transcendent visions, of Cybele herself welcoming them into her divine fold. Their wounds became sacred scars, proof of a bond no ordinary worship could match. And that was the cult's irresistible pull in a single, irreversible act. The Galli didn't just serve the goddess, they became her eternal consorts, living testaments to the price of divine love. Rome's eventual crackdown couldn't kill the allure. Even as laws pushed the Galli to the fringes, their practices seeped into other mystery cults, and whispers of Attis' pine tree rebirth echoed in early Christian resurrection symbolism. The cult of Cybele forces us to confront a stark truth. For some in antiquity, the ultimate act of faith wasn't prayer or sacrifice, but the willing surrender of one's very flesh to the divine knife. Deep beneath the bustling streets of Rome, in candlelit chambers carved from bedrock, men gathered to perform a ritual so secret that even its name was whispered, the Tauroctony. At the center of these underground temples, called Mithraea, sprawled a vivid scene frozen in stone. The god Mithra's knees pressed into the back of a massive bull, dagger plunged deep into its neck as a dog and snake lunged for the blood, and a scorpion clung to its genitals. This wasn't just art, it was the heart of a mystery cult that rivaled early Christianity, a ritual reenacted by initiates who believed it held the key to cosmic power and personal salvation. But why a bull, and why did this bloody tableau captivate soldiers, merchants, and emperors alike? The answer lies in the stars. Every element of the Tauroctony was a coded celestial map. The bull represented Taurus, the constellation whose displacement by the sun during the spring equinox marked the ancient astrological age of Taurus. Mithra's dagger strike symbolized the sun's victory over this age, ushering in a new cosmic order. The creatures feasting on the bull's blood weren't random. They were constellations: Canis Minor the dog, Hydra the snake, and Scorpio the scorpion. Even the cloak billowing behind Mithras mimicked the Milky Way. For initiates, this wasn't mere slaughter. It was a divine reset, a reenactment of the moment the universe shifted its axis. But understanding the symbols was only the first step. During initiation, members progressed through 7 grades: Raven, Bridegroom, Soldier, Lion, Persian, Sun Runner, and Father, each tied to a planetary sphere. Climbing this ladder required enduring trials that mirrored Mithra's own struggles. Blindfolded, starved, or exposed to freezing water, the highest ranks participated in a ceremonial reenactment of the Tauroctony, consuming ritual meals of bread and wine atop stone slabs where the bull's blood would have flowed. To outsiders, it might have looked like crude theatrics, but for those in the know, each gesture was a step toward immortality. The cult's appeal was no accident. Mithraism thrived among Rome's legions, spreading along trade routes and military camps from Scotland to Syria. Its promise of brotherhood and transcendence resonated with men navigating the brutal hierarchy of imperial life. Unlike the wild, gender-fluid rites of Cybele, Mithraea were strictly male spaces, no women allowed. This exclusivity wasn't about misogyny, but about replicating Mithra's own mythic journey, a path forged through masculine camaraderie and discipline. The dim, cave-like temples mirrored the grotto where Mithra slew the bull, their ceilings often painted with stars to reinforce the connection between the ritual and the cosmos. Archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of these sanctuaries, many hidden beneath later churches, a silent testament to the cult's influence before Christianity eclipsed it. The Tauroctony's legacy lingers in unexpected places. Some scholars see echoes of its sacred meal in the Eucharist, while its astrological symbolism resurfaces in medieval alchemy. But perhaps its most enduring lesson is this: for ancient believers, the divine wasn't a distant force to be petitioned. It was a drama to be relived, a secret to be earned, and above all, a star-charted journey where every drop of blood held the weight of the universe. Among the many strange practices of ancient Greek mystery cults, few were as extreme or as revealing as the Pythagorean vow of silence. Imagine joining a philosophical brotherhood only to be forbidden from speaking for 5 long years. Not a word, not a whisper, just complete, unbroken silence, all because Pythagoras and his followers believed human speech was a pollutant, a stain on the purity of the soul. This wasn't just about discipline, it was about rewiring the mind, stripping away the noise of daily life to hear the hidden harmonies of the universe. New initiates in Pythagoras' inner circle faced this trial immediately. They would spend their first years in the community as acousmatikoi, or listeners, absorbing teachings without uttering a single question or objection. The penalty for breaking silence: banishment. One infamous anecdote tells of a disciple who, after years of restraint, finally spoke out only to be exiled the same day. his belongings burned in a ritual fire as if his very presence had become a contagion. Another tells of a man who died rather than cry out for help when attackers set upon him. So fiercely did he cling to his oath, but why such an extreme practice? For Pythagoras, numbers weren't just symbols, they were divine. He taught that the cosmos operated on mathematical principles, that the movement of planets and the vibrations of strings all followed sacred ratios. Speech, with its messy imprecision, disrupted these harmonies. Silence, on the other hand, allowed the soul to attune itself to the music of the spheres, the same celestial symphony that governed the orbits of stars. In this context, words weren't just unnecessary, they were dangerous, capable of drowning out the very truths initiates sought to understand. The vow wasn't just about restraint, it was a test of intellectual humility. By forcing students to listen before they spoke, Pythagoras ensured they didn't approach knowledge with arrogance. Those who endured the silence emerged, it was said, with voices purified, able to speak truths that resonated with mathematical perfection. Even then, their words were measured. Followers avoided idle chatter, believing careless speech could disrupt the soul's balance. They communicated in riddles and symbols, their language as precise as the geometry they revered. Archaeological evidence hints at how seriously these rules were taken. Excavations near Croton, where Pythagoras founded his school, revealed dwellings with unusually thick walls, perhaps designed to minimize outside noise and preserve the sanctity of silence. Ancient critics like Aristotle mocked the practice, calling it excessive, but the Pythagoreans held firm. For them, silence wasn't emptiness, it was the space where true understanding took root. This radical idea still echoes today. Modern neuroscience confirms that prolonged silence can rewire the brain, enhancing focus and creativity. But the Pythagoreans took it further, believing that in the absence of human noise, you could hear the whisper of the divine. Their silence was a prayer, a meditation, and above all, a testament to the power of listening not just to others, but to the hidden order of the world itself. Picture kneeling in a torchlit chamber, hands trembling as a priest drapes a writhing serpent over your shoulders. Its scales glint in the flickering light as it slithers down your tunic, cool against your skin, not as a threat but as a sacred messenger. This was the heart of initiation in the cult of Sabazios, a deity whose mysteries blurred the lines between Greek and Phrygian tradition. The serpent wasn't just a prop, it was a living symbol of transformation, its sinuous movement mirroring the initiate's journey from mortality to divine connection. The ritual's brilliance lay in its physicality. As the snake coiled inside the initiate's clothing, its path traced the spine, a deliberate metaphor for awakening dormant power. Ancient texts describe the serpent as chthonic, a creature bridging the underworld and the living, its shed skin embodying rebirth, but the shock value wasn't incidental. Surviving the ordeal proved one's worthiness. After all, facing a venomous animal without flinch required a surrender to the god's will that mere words couldn't convey. Archaeological finds bolster this. Bronze votive hands, likely used in Sabazios' rites, feature serpents winding around the fingers, some even coiled atop miniature pine cones, a nod to the cult's ties to Dionysian ecstasy. What made this practice especially controversial was how it was weaponized by early Christians. By the 2nd century CE, critics like Clement of Alexandria were branding Sabazios' devotees as snake worshippers, twisting their rituals into proof of pagan depravity. The irony, those same accusers would later adopt serpent symbolism themselves. Think of Moses' bronze serpent or Christ's injunction to be wise as serpents. The difference, of course, lay in control. For Christians, the serpent was a symbol to be conquered. For Sabazios' initiates, it was a sacred collaborator, its wildness a necessary part of the divine encounter. The cult's legacy slithers into unexpected places. Some scholars trace echoes of its serpent rites to modern folk traditions, like the Appalachian practice of handling venomous snakes in ecstatic worship. Whether coincidence or cultural memory, the thread remains unbroken. The serpent still unsettles, still transfixes, still promises transformation if only we dare to let it coil close. For the initiates of Sabazios, that moment of contact wasn't heresy. It was the first whisper of the god's voice, hissing through the scales of a creature far older than any temple. In the pitch-black depths of caves where even the bravest would hesitate to venture, followers of Hecate, goddess of magic, and the crossroads gathered to read the future in the dance of flames. This was lampodomancy, torch divination, a practice as mesmerizing as it was mysterious. Picture the scene: standing stones slick with condensation, the air thick with the scent of burning pine resin, and a circle of initiates holding aloft torches whose flames twisted and leaped in the subterranean draft. Every flicker, every sudden flare or dimming was scrutinized, believed to carry messages from the spirit world. Unlike the orderly prophecies of Delphi's oracle, this was divination stripped bare, raw, immediate, and deeply personal, where the divine spoke not in riddles but in the primal language of fire. The rituals began with purification. Initiates fasted for days, bathed in icy streams, and anointed their foreheads with oils meant to heighten perception. Only then were they led into the caves, often at night when Hecate's power was strongest. The torches themselves weren't ordinary. Their wood was carefully selected, often from cypress or yew trees associated with the underworld, and the pitch mixed with herbs like opium poppy or henbane to induce mild trance states. As the flames cast jagged shadows on the walls, a priestess would chant invocations, her voice echoing off the stone like a chorus of spirits. The initiate's task was to stare into the fire until their vision blurred, allowing the flames to morph into shapes. A serpent coiling might warn of betrayal, while a sudden upward surge could signal divine favor. What made lampodomancy unique was its reliance on collective interpretation. Unlike other forms of divination, where a single priest delivered the message, here every participant might perceive different omens, their readings debated in hushed tones. A flame splitting into two could mean a crossroads decision for one initiate, while another saw it as a sign of Hecate's presence. The goddess often depicted holding twin torches. The ambiguity wasn't a flaw, it was the point. Hecate ruled over liminal spaces, and her messages thrived in uncertainty. Archaeological evidence from sites like Lagina in Anatolia reveals torch brackets carved with Hecate's triple-faced image, positioned precisely where drafts would make flames tremble. Clearly, this wasn't random guesswork, it was stage-managed revelation, designed to amplify the uncanny. Critics in antiquity dismissed lampodomancy as mere superstition, a play of light and shadow gullible minds mistook for prophecy. But modern psychology suggests otherwise. The flickering flames, combined with sensory deprivation and herbal additives, likely induced a hypnagogic state where the brain projects meaning onto random patterns, a phenomenon still exploited today in flame-gazing therapies. For Hecate's followers, the visions were undeniably real, their truths as sharp as the torch smoke stinging their eyes, and in a world where the future was as dark as those caves, the ability to snatch even a glimmer of foresight was worth any ordeal. The practice's legacy lingers in unexpected ways. Medieval witches adopted similar torch rituals, and even modern pagans reenact lampodomancy during Hecate's sacred nights. But perhaps its most enduring lesson is this: sometimes to see clearly, you must first embrace the darkness and trust that the flames will reveal what the daylight cannot. The drums started before dawn, a thunderous, heartbeat rhythm shaking the earth like the footsteps of the gods themselves. This was the call of the Corybantes, Cybele's wild-eyed attendants, whose masked dances didn't just honor the goddess, they shattered the boundaries of human consciousness. Picture the scene: a circle of dancers clad in animal hides, their faces hidden behind grotesque wooden masks, cymbals crashing as their bodies convulsed to the relentless pulse of the tympanum drum. To outsiders, it looked like chaos, but for initiates, this was the gateway to ecstasy, a carefully choreographed unraveling of the self. The Corybantes' rituals were more than performance, they were a kind of sacred violence against the mind. Ancient sources describe participants dancing for hours, even days, until their muscles gave out and their thoughts dissolved into pure sensation. The masks played a crucial role. Carved with exaggerated, gaping mouths and bulging eyes, they transformed wearers into living vessels of divine madness. Some scholars believe the mask's grotesque features triggered a psychological phenomenon called depersonalization, where prolonged exposure to distorted faces made dancers forget their own identities. Add the relentless drumming, often reaching 4 to 7 beats per second, a frequency known to alter brainwave patterns, and the result was a trance so deep, devotees reported visions of Cybele herself descending to possess them. Modern research sheds startling light on these ancient practices. Neuroscientists studying rhythmic rituals in cultures from West Africa to Haiti have identified a trance threshold, a precise tempo at which repetitive sound overwhelms the brain's ability to process information, triggering dissociative states. The Corybantes' drumming likely hit this sweet spot, their rhythms mimicking the human pulse during panic, tricking the body into a fight or flight response without actual danger. The effect was compounded by the dancer's exhaustion and the mask's eerie distortions, creating a feedback loop where movement, sound, and visual stimuli conspired to eject the mind from its moorings. But the Corybantes didn't just induce trances, they weaponized them. These rites were often prescribed as therapy for mental illness, particularly what the Greeks called melancholia, a catch-all term for depression, anxiety, and what we might now call PTSD. The logic was counterintuitive but brilliant. By flooding the body with controlled chaos, they could purge uncontrolled chaos from the soul. Philosopher Plato even endorsed the practice, suggesting in laws that Corybantic dances could reharmonize a disturbed psyche by overwhelming it with ecstatic release. Archaeological finds support this. Medical sanctuaries dedicated to Cybele have yielded masks with tears carved into their cheeks, suggesting rituals where initiates wept their way through catharsis. The legacy of these dances pulses through modern culture. From the whirling dervishes of Sufism to the electronic beats of rave culture, humans still seek transcendence through rhythm and movement. Even psychotherapy echoes the Corybantes' approach to today's EMDR treatment for trauma uses rhythmic eye movements to reprocess memories, not unlike the drumming that once guided ancient souls back to equilibrium. The masks may have changed, but the impulse remains. Sometimes, to heal, we must first lose ourselves in the drumbeat, the dance, the delicious surrender to something older than reason. The Corybantes understood what science is only now confirming, that the line between madness and salvation is often just a heartbeat away. In the hushed inner sanctums of ancient Greek mystery cults, names weren't just labels, they were living keys to divine power. Among the most closely guarded secrets were the true names of gods, whispered only to initiates under oath, their syllables believed to vibrate with the very essence of the deities they invoked. Take Persephone, queen of the underworld. To outsiders, she was the familiar daughter of Demeter, but within the Eleusinian mysteries, she answered to Despoina, the mistress, a name so potent that speaking it carelessly could sever the speaker from her favor. This wasn't mere tradition, it was spiritual cryptography where knowing a god's hidden name meant holding a fragment of their power in your tongue. The belief in naming magic ran deep. Just as knowing someone's true name could grant influence over them in ancient spells, so too did the gods' secret identities offer initiates a direct line to their presence. The Orphic hymns, for example, listed dozens of epithets for Dionysus: Bromios, the roaring one, Lysios, the liberator, each revealing a different facet of his divinity. Uttering these names wasn't just prayer, it was participation in the god's myth, a way to summon specific aspects of their power. A farmer pleading for fertile fields might call Demeter Chloe, the green shoot, while a mourner seeking solace in the afterlife would invoke her as the Smephoros, lawbringer, aligning their plea with her role as Persephone's mother. This practice wasn't arbitrary, it reflected a worldview where language pulsed with creative force. The Egyptian concept of Heka magical speech bled into Greek thought, reinforcing the idea that words could shape reality. In the cult of Isis, which syncretized Greek and Egyptian traditions, initiates learned that Isis herself gained power by tricking Ra into revealing his true name, a story that mirrored Greek cautionary tales about divine secrecy. Even Plato wrestled with this idea in Cratylus, debating whether names were intrinsic to their reference or merely human conventions. For mystery cults, the answer was clear. The right name in the right context could open doors between worlds. Archaeology offers tantalizing clues. Cursed tablets found in Attica show names of gods written backward or scrambled attempts to harness their power while avoiding backlash. Gold leaves buried with Orphic initiates sometimes bear cryptic epithets like Eubuleus, a name shared by Dionysius and Hades, suggesting these words served as passwords in the afterlife. The message was unmistakable. To know a god's hidden name was to stand on holy ground where mortal breath could stir divine response, but this power came with peril. Ancient texts warn of initiates struck mute or driven mad for misusing sacred names. The penalty for leaking them extended beyond death. The Eleusinian punishment promised eternal torment in Hades. This wasn't superstition, it was a recognition of names as living things, too volatile for unworthy lips. Modern echoes linger in traditions like Judaism's avoidance of Yahweh's full pronunciation or the Catholic practice of baptismal names. The mystery cults understood something primal, that naming isn't just identification, it's invocation, a summoning of forces older than language itself. And in those whispered syllables, initiates didn't just speak to the gods, they spoke as them, if only for a breath. The darkness was absolute, the kind of black that pressed against your eyelids like a physical weight. Then, without warning, a scream split the air, guttural and raw, followed by the deafening clang of bronze shields smashed together inches from your face. This was the moment of Brimo, a ritual so terrifying its name meant the Angry One, where initiates faced a gauntlet of orchestrated horrors designed to break them open, psychologically and spiritually. Unlike the quiet contemplation of Pythagorean silence or the fiery visions of Lampedomancy, this ordeal weaponized sheer terror as a path to enlightenment. Ancient sources describe initiates led blindfolded through labyrinthine tunnels, their bare feet scraping against cold stone, only to be ambushed by cultists wearing masks of gorgons and furies. Some were forced to hold live scorpions, others heard whispers naming them as condemned souls already dead in the eyes of the gods. The goal wasn't cruelty, it was alchemy. By confronting their deepest fears in a controlled setting, initiates underwent a symbolic death, their old selves shattered like the terracotta pots sometimes smashed during the rites. Only those who endured could be reborn into the cult's inner circle, their resolve tempered like steel in fire. Modern psychology recognizes this as exposure therapy, where controlled trauma rewires the brain's response to fear. The Greeks, of course, framed it mythically. The Brimo rites mirrored Persephone's descent into Hades or Dionysus' dismemberment by Titans, but the mechanism was startlingly sophisticated. Initiates weren't just scared, they were guided through cycles of terror and catharsis, often culminating in a dramatic reveal, a priestess lifting her mask to show a benign smile, or the monsters unmasking as fellow members. This bait and switch, ancient texts suggest, triggered euphoric relief, flooding the body with endorphins and creating a visceral association between terror and transcendence. Archaeological evidence abounds. At sites like Samothrace, narrow underground corridors bear scorch marks where torches were suddenly extinguished, and niches where actors likely hid to stage ambushes. Vase paintings depict initiates recoiling from figures in Hecate's triple-faced masks, their mouths wide in screams that might be horror or ecstasy or both. Even the tools of terror were sacred. The rhombos, a bull roarer swung on ropes to produce a bone-chilling howl, wasn't just a noisemaker but a symbol of the god's voice shaking the cosmos. The brilliance of these rites lay in their duality. By surviving simulated horrors, initiates proved their resilience to actual suffering, a valuable trait in an era of plagues and wars. But there was a darker subtext. The cult's new fear's power to create loyalty. Once you've trembled beside someone in the dark, shared that primal gasp of relief, you're bound to them in ways reason can't undo. It's no coincidence that armies and fraternities still use controlled hazing to forge group identity. The mystery cult simply understood something we often forget, that terror, when carefully ritualized, can be the quickest path to trust. And in a world where the gods themselves were capricious, learning to face the irrational wasn't just spirituality, it was survival. In the flickering torchlight of underground sanctuaries, initiates would extend their wrists without hesitation as a priest wound thin, crimson cords around their flesh, not to restrain but to consecrate. This was the ritual of binding and unbinding, a practice central to many Greek mystery cults where physical knots mirrored spiritual transformation. The cords weren't mere symbols, they were living contracts, their tight coils representing the initiate's mortal limitations, and their eventual release a promise of divine liberation. Imagine standing in that sacred space, feeling the fibers bite into your skin as the priest invoked Hecate or Dionysius, each knot tied with a whispered incantation. This wasn't theater. It was alchemy where rope became the medium between human frailty and godly power. Archaeology reveals just how literal these bindings could be. Across Greece and Magna Graecia, lead-cursed tablets called kateidsmoi have been unearthed with tiny cords still twisted around them, some even pierced with nails to fix the spell. These weren't the delicate threads of the initiation rites but tools of raw, coercive magic. A lover might bind the name of their unrequited passion onto such a tablet, while a merchant could ensnare a rival's fortunes with knots modeled after those used in mysteries. The parallel was deliberate. Just as initiates were temporarily bound to awaken their souls, these curses sought to shackle their victims permanently, twisting sacred symbolism into weapons of control. But in the mystery cults, the binding always preceded release, a duality etched into their most profound rituals. During the Dionysian Desmotes rites, initiates wrapped in grapevines would writhe against their restraints, reenacting the gods' mythical imprisonment by the Titans. Only when the priest sliced the vines with a ritual knife were they reborn as Lysioi, the freed ones. The cords here served a paradoxical purpose, to simulate the soul's entanglement in materialism before its dramatic emancipation. Even the language of these ceremonies blurred the lines between literal and metaphorical. Ancient texts speak of loosing the bonds of Moira, the goddess of fate, suggesting these rituals offered escape from destiny itself. The psychological power of these practices can't be overstated. Modern studies on restraint therapy show how physical binding, when paired with guided narrative, can produce profound shifts in perception. For the initiates, the visceral sensation of confinement followed by sudden release likely triggered cathartic emotional surges, reinforcing the cult's teachings about transcending human limitations. This wasn't passive worship, it was embodied philosophy where the body's memory of constraint and freedom made abstract concepts tangible. A gold leaf from a Thessalian grave captures this perfectly, its inscription urging the deceased to declare to Persephone, "I have paid the price for my unbound life." What makes these binding rituals especially fascinating is their echoes in later traditions. From the untying ceremonies in Hindu weddings to the cords worn by Franciscan monks, the symbolism of sacred knots crosses cultures and millennia. Even our modern phrases, tying the knot, bound by duty, carry faint whispers of these ancient rites. The mystery cults understood something neuroscience now confirms. Tactile experiences anchor belief more deeply than words alone. When those final chords fell away, initiates didn't just hear about liberation, they felt it in their bones, a somatic truth no argument could ever unravel. The temple precincts of Aphrodite smelled of myrrh and sea salt, but beneath the incense, whispered rumors swirled about practices so scandalous they'd make even a Corinthian sailor blush. For centuries, historians repeated tales of sacred prostitution in the goddesses' sanctuaries, where devotees allegedly performed ritual sex as acts of worship. The stories are lurid, women surrendering their bodies to strangers in exchange for divine favor, their acts funneling profits directly into temple coffers. But peel back the layers of moral outrage, and a far more nuanced truth emerges, one tangled in ancient politics, modern misconceptions, and the enduring habit of painting foreign religions as decadent. At the heart of the controversy stand the hierodules, temple servants whose exact roles remain hotly debated. Texts from Herodotus to Strabo describe these women at sites like Babylon's Ishtar Temple and Corinth's Acrocorinth, but the details blur under scrutiny. The Greek term hierodoulos simply means sacred slave, a designation that could encompass everything from weavers maintaining the goddess's robes to musicians performing at festivals. Only later Christian authors like Clement of Alexandria explicitly conflated them with sex work, framing their service as institutionalized depravity. Yet archaeology complicates this narrative. Excavations at Aphrodite's main Corinthian sanctuary revealed no brothel-like quarters, only workshops for perfume production, a commodity intimately tied to the goddess's worship. The distortion likely began with cultural bias. When Herodotus described Babylonian women sitting in the temple of Aphrodite awaiting strangers, he was recording a practice he found shocking, not one the Babylonians themselves framed as prostitution. Similar accounts of Cyprus's Aphrodite cults may reflect Greek observers misinterpreting fertility rites involving symbolic marriage to the goddess. A terracotta figurine from Paphos shows a woman lifting her skirts, not as an invitation, but as a ritual gesture invoking Aphrodite's power over birth and agriculture. Even the famed price lists from some temples probably tracked offerings, not carnal transactions. That's not to say sexuality played no role in Aphrodite's worship. Athenian comedies joked about working girls seeking the goddess's blessing, and courtesans like Phryne financed temple renovations. But the leap from acknowledging sex workers as devotees to claiming sex as liturgy is vast. The confusion stems partly from Aphrodite's dual identity. She presided over both marital love and raw desire, making her a magnet for projections. By late antiquity, Christian polemicists seized on this ambiguity, recasting her temples as dens of vice to justify their destruction. A 4th century bishop's account of converting Aphrodite's sanctuary into a church boasts of driving out the demons of lust, a narrative more about propaganda than historical fact. Perhaps the most telling evidence comes from economics. If sacred prostitution were as widespread as claimed, why do temple inventories never mention earnings from it? Why do legal texts from Kos regulate conventional brothels but omit any reference to cultic sex? The likelier scenario is that fringe practices, perhaps akin to modern tantric rituals, existed in small pockets, then got exaggerated into sensational stereotypes. Like the myth of Vestal virgins being buried alive for breaking chastity, the trope of sacred prostitution says more about ancient slander than actual religion. Yet the legend persists, fed by our own fascination with the intersection of faith and desire. Modern reconstructions of Aphrodite's worship often lean into the titillating version because purity rarely makes for compelling drama. The truth is quieter but no less profound. In a world where the divine touched every aspect of life, from childbirth to commerce, Aphrodite's hierodules weren't scandalous figures, they were honored mediators between the sacred and the sensual. Their real work wasn't selling pleasure, but embodying the goddess's most radical lesson. That love, in all its forms, could be a path to the divine. The body lay washed but not anointed, wrapped in plain linen as the mourners gathered until a priest stepped forward, cradling an amber-filled jar. Slowly, deliberately, he poured thick, golden honey over the corpse's forehead, letting it drip down the cold flesh like liquid sunlight. This wasn't mere embalming, it was alchemy. For the Orphic cults, honey wasn't just food, it was the sacred bridge between the realms of the living and the dead, a substance so pure it could cleanse a soul stained by earthly existence. Bees held an almost mystical status in ancient Greek spirituality. They were considered winged messengers between worlds, their hives echoing the structured chaos of the cosmos. Honey, as their gift, carried divine connotations, the nectar of immortality, sipped by gods on Olympus. But for the Orphics, its power ran deeper. Their texts describe honey baths as the final purification, stripping away the residue of mortal life so the soul could ascend unburdened. Imagine the logic. Just as bees transmute flower essence into golden sweetness, so too could honey transform death's decay into something eternal. Archaeological evidence abounds. Excavations from Crete to Thessaly reveal burial jars lined with crystallized honey residue, some still cradling the bones they once anointed. The ritual's brilliance lay in its layers of meaning. Honey didn't just symbolize purity, it actively prevented corruption. Its natural preservative properties, well understood by ancient cultures, made it a practical choice for delaying decomposition. But the Orphics took this further. They believed the soul, like honey, was trapped in a cycle of transformation. Just as bees died each winter only for new swarms to rise in spring, human souls cycled through rebirth until Orphic rites broke the chain. By bathing the dead in honey, initiates mimicked the fate of Orpheus himself, whose severed head still singing was said to have been preserved by nymphs in a honeycomb. The connection to other mystery traditions is striking. In Eleusis, initiates drank Kykeon, a barley and mint concoction sometimes mixed with honey to commune with Demeter. The Mycenaeans buried their elites with honey cakes for Persephone's favor. Even Homer's Odysseus used honeyed milk to summon ghosts from the underworld. But the Orphics stood apart by making honey the final, irrevocable step in soul purification. Their gold funeral tablets, often found pressed against the lips of the dead, carried instructions to avoid the spring of forgetfulness and seek the lake of memory, where honey-sweet waters would seal their divinity. Modern science underscores honey's preservative power. Think of the millennia-old pots still sealed with edible honey in Egyptian tombs. But the Orphics glimpsed something beyond chemistry. In their cosmology, where the soul was a divine spark trapped in mortal flesh, honey's golden glow mirrored the light it sought to reclaim. When those last sticky rivulets dripped into the grave, they weren't just anointing a corpse, they were rewiring the very fabric of fate. To the Orphics, death wasn't an end. It was the moment the soul, finally cleansed, could dissolve into the sweetness from which it came. Standing naked before a panel of stone-faced priests, an initiate's body and soul were laid bare under the piercing gaze of those who held the keys to the divine. This was the docomasia, the testing, a brutal gauntlet of physical and moral scrutiny designed to strip away every pretense, every hidden flaw, before allowing passage into the inner sanctum. Imagine the scene, days of fasting that left limbs trembling, followed by invasive examinations where priests measured scars, noted birthmarks, and even scrutinized body odor for signs of impurity. But the true ordeal came when the questions began, relentless interrogations demanding confessions of past sins, from petty theft to unspeakable acts, all under the looming threat of expulsion if even a single lie slipped through. These trials weren't arbitrary cruelty. Like a blacksmith purging dross from molten metal, the docomasia aimed to refine initiates through humiliation, forging them into vessels worthy of sacred knowledge. The Pythagoreans took this to extremes, rejecting candidates with defective proportions or weak voices, believing physical imperfections mirrored spiritual ones. In the cult of Isis, initiates endured public moral tribunals where bystanders could accuse them of hidden vices, a practice echoing Athens' legal docomasia for public office, where even a rumor of cowardice in battle could derail a career. The message was clear: the gods demanded transparency, and the path to enlightenment began with total surrender of pride. Modern parallels leap to mind. University fraternities hazing rituals, sleep deprivation, forced calisthenics, or humiliating confessions mirror these ancient trials in both form and function. Both use ordeal as a bonding mechanism, weeding out the uncommitted while forging loyalty among survivors. But where fraternities test endurance for its own sake, the mystery cult's docomasia served a metaphysical purpose. A gold leaf from a Thessalian grave spells it out. Pure I come from the pure, the soul declares to Persephone, its purity hard-won through ritual trials. The docomasia wasn't just about suffering, it was about proving one's capacity to hold divine secrets without corruption. Archaeology offers haunting glimpses of these rites. At Eleusis, a stone basin called the Kykeon still bears stains from the lustral waters used to wash initiates post-scrutiny. Vase paintings show naked men kneeling as priests examine their hands, possibly checking for softness that might betray a life avoiding manual labor. Even the lexicon of these tests survives. The Greek word dokimazo still means both to assay metals and to judge character, a linguistic fossil of the cult's alchemical worldview. What fascinates most is the psychological acumen behind these trials. By forcing initiates to relive their deepest shames before strangers, the docomasia created a catharsis modern therapy would recognize. The act of voicing transgressions, whether true or fabricated, allowed participants to symbolically shed their old selves, emerging reborn into the cult's embrace. Unlike the secrecy of Catholic confession, these admissions were often public, leveraging social accountability to cement transformation. A 6th century BC tablet from Crete records an initiate's confession to stealing a neighbor's figs, a mundane crime, yet one whose admission under oath carried cosmic weight. The docomasia's legacy lingers in unexpected corners. From Masonic lodge examinations to military security clearances, the idea that profound trust requires profound vulnerability remains ingrained. But the ancient cults grasped something deeper. That true initiation isn't just about proving worthiness, it's about dismantling the ego that makes us unworthy. When those priests stared into an initiate's eyes, they weren't just seeking flaws. They were watching for the moment pride broke, leaving only the raw, trembling possibility of something new. And in that moment of utter exposure, the real mystery began. On a day of gathering storms, the streets of Athens would fall silent as a ragged figure. Sometimes a slave, sometimes a criminal, sometimes just an unlucky soul, was dragged toward the city gates. This was the pharmakos, the human scapegoat, upon whose shoulders would be piled every sin, every misfortune, every drop of ill luck plaguing the community. Crowned with figs and beaten with leeks and wild onions, they were both reviled and reverenced, a living sacrifice offered not to the gods but to the collective conscience of the city itself. The ritual's power lay in its brutal simplicity. By loading their sins onto a single outcast and driving them away, or in some accounts stoning them to death, the community believed they could purify themselves through expulsion. Ancient sources describe how these scapegoats were first fed at public expense, their temporary, kingly status a grim mockery of the fate awaiting them. The figs around their neck weren't just symbols of fertility, they carried the sticky weight of the city's guilt, absorbing corruption like sponges. When the crowd finally hurled stones or drove the pharmakos beyond the walls, they weren't just banishing a person, they were exorcising chaos itself. This practice didn't emerge in a vacuum. It mirrored myths where heroes like Oedipus, the ultimate pharmakos, took the sins of Thebes upon himself through self-exile. Even the term pharmakos holds a dark double meaning. It can mean both poison and cure, reflecting the belief that the outcast suffering acted as a social antidote. The ritual's timing was deliberate too, often performed during the Thargelia festival in May. It coincided with the precarious gap between planting and harvest, when communities felt most vulnerable to divine wrath. By sacrificing the pharmakos, they sought to tip the scales back in their favor. Archaeology offers chilling evidence. Potsherds found near Athenian gates bear crude drawings of bound figures, some labeled kathama, cleanings. Even the topography of the ritual mattered. The pharmakos was typically driven out through the Dipylon Gate, a liminal space where the city's boundaries blurred, reinforcing the idea that they carried pollution into the realm of the unknown. What's often overlooked is how these rituals reveal the fragility of ancient Greek notions of justice. Unlike trials which required evidence, the selection of a pharmakos was arbitrary, sometimes decided by lot, sometimes by sheer mob momentum. This wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about the primal need to assign blame when crops failed or plague struck. The pharmakos became a walking metaphor, their body a canvas for projecting collective fears. Yet there's a haunting paradox here. The very act of expulsion temporarily bonded the community together, a shared violence that reinforced social cohesion. Modern psychology recognizes this pattern in phenomena like witch hunts or political scapegoating. The Greeks simply ritualized it, giving chaos a name, a face, and a road out of town. The pharmakos' legacy lingers in our language. The word scapegoat itself comes from the biblical Azazel ritual, but the concept is universal. From ancient Athens to modern discrimination, the human impulse to purge anxieties through a sacrificial victim remains unsettlingly familiar. The mystery cults took this further, framing the pharmakos not just as a social tool, but as a cosmic necessity, a flawed mirror held up to society's darkest face. In their exile, they carried more than just figs and leeks. They carried the unspoken truth that every community, no matter how civilized, has its shadows. And sometimes it's easier to banish them than to look too closely. At the heart of many Greek mystery sanctuaries stood an object so unassuming yet so charged with power that initiates would spend hours kneeling before it, the omphalos, a smooth, egg-shaped stone believed to be the literal navel of the world. These weren't just decorative artifacts, they were living conduits to the divine, pulsating with the same primordial energy that once coursed through the veins of Gaia herself. The most famous stood at Delphi, where priests claimed it marked the exact spot where two eagles released by Zeus from opposite ends of the earth had met, the cosmic center where heaven and underworld touched. But lesser-known omphaloi dotted secretive cult sites across Greece, each one a focal point for seekers of hidden wisdom. The rituals surrounding these stones were as strange as they were precise. Initiates would first purify themselves in icy mountain springs, their skin still prickling with cold as they approached the stone in pre-dawn darkness. With palms pressed against its curved surface, sometimes still stained with the oil of previous devotees, they'd begin to chant, their words syncing with the rhythmic rise and fall of their breath. Ancient texts describe how the stones grew warm under prolonged contact, as if responding to human touch with stored solar energy. Some initiates reported visions, swirling colors behind closed eyelids, the sensation of floating above their bodies, or even hearing voices whispering from the stone itself. A 2nd century inscription from a Theban cult describes one woman's encounter where the omphalos spoke in the tongue of the first gods, revealing prophecies that later came true. What made these stones so special? Their power likely stemmed from a blend of geology and belief. Many were carved from meteoric iron or magnetic lodestone, materials the ancients associated with celestial forces. The omphalos at Delphi rested directly over intersecting fault lines that released ethylene gas, a known hallucinogen which may explain the trance states of the Pythia. But mystery cults took this further, claiming certain stones were fragments of the original omphalos, scattered by gods to create sacred nodes in a divine network. Initiates at Eleusis spoke of a black omphalos that drank moonlight, while Orphic hymns reference stones that could record the memories of those who touched them. The meditation techniques used with these stones reveal sophisticated proto-scientific understanding. Instructions carved into a temple wall in Epidorus detail how to align one's spine with the stone's axis to open the channels of insight. Modern biofeedback researchers note this posture mirrors techniques to enhance alpha brain waves, suggesting the ancients stumbled upon neurobiological truths through ritual. Some omphaloi were even intentionally placed atop natural telluric currents, their positions corresponding to what dowsers now identify as ley lines. When an initiate sat cross-legged before these stones, they weren't just praying, they were plugging into an ancient energy grid. The legacy of the omphalos stretches surprisingly far. Early Christian churches often built altars over pagan omphaloi, repurposing their sacred geography. Medieval alchemists sought philosophers' stones with similar egg-like shapes, believing them to hold condensed cosmic wisdom. Even today, visitors to Delphi report strange sensations when touching the replica omphalos' tingling hands, sudden emotional surges, or the inexplicable feeling that the stone is listening. Perhaps this is the greatest mystery of all, that an object so simple could become a lens for the divine, not through elaborate ceremony, but through the quiet, persistent act of human attention. In a world obsessed with complexity, the omphalos reminds us that sometimes truth waits in the curve of a stone, humming with the memory of when earth and heaven were one. The bellow of the bull echoed through the sun-baked courtyard as a lithe figure clad only in a loincloth sprinted toward the charging beast. At the last possible moment, they vaulted onto the creature's back, grasping its horns as it whipped its head upward, launching them into a dizzying somersault over its spine before landing steadily or sprawled in the dust. This was no mere spectacle. It was Taurocathapsia, the sacred bull leaping of Minoan Crete, a ritual so dangerous and dazzling that even today, scholars argue whether it was physical feat, spiritual metaphor, or both. Frescoes from Knossos depict these acrobatic acts in vivid detail, ochre-skinned youths mid-flight, their bodies arcing over bulls with surreal grace. But what these paintings don't show are the broken bones, the trampled bodies, the very real risk of death that accompanied each leap. For the Minoans, bulls weren't just animals, they were avatars of primordial power, their horns echoing the crescent moon and their brute strength embodying the untamed forces of nature. To confront one wasn't just a test of courage, it was a dance with divinity, where a single misstep could mean annihilation or apotheosis. The connection to mystery cults runs deeper than adrenaline. Bull leaping likely featured in rites tied to the mistress of animals, a Minoan goddess later syncretized with Artemis and Potnia. Initiates who survived the ordeal weren't just proving physical prowess, they were reenacting a cosmic drama. Just as Theseus navigated the labyrinth to slay the Minotaur, a myth possibly rooted in distorted memories of these rituals, leapers symbolically conquered the beast of mortality itself. The bull's back became a liminal space, the split second of flight, a metaphor for the soul's fleeting escape from earthly shackles. Yet the question persists, did they really do it? Modern experiments with trained bulls suggest the maneuvers are theoretically possible but astronomically risky. Some scholars argue the frescoes symbolize astral events, with bulls representing Taurus and leapers embodying celestial bodies. Others point to terracotta figurines showing bull leapers in midair, their poses too precise to be purely artistic fancy. The truth may lie in between actual leaps performed by a daring few, later stylized into religious iconography. Archaeology adds another layer. At Knossos, the bull court lacks protective barriers, implying spectators shared the risk, a collective baptism by hoof and horn. Bull-shaped rhytons found in sanctuaries contain traces of hallucinogens, hinting that leapers might have been intoxicated, blurring the line between physical feat and visionary trance. Even the bulls themselves were likely specially bred for the rite, their aggression heightened for maximum symbolic impact. What's undeniable is the ritual's psychological power. Unlike Roman gladiatorial combat, where the goal was slaughter, Minoan bull leaping celebrated temporary mastery over chaos. The leaper didn't kill the bull, they harnessed its energy, channeling its raw power into a moment of transcendent balance. In that heartbeat between launch and landing, they became both mortal and immortal, human and divine, a living mystery suspended between earth and sky. The legacy of these leaps lingers in Spain's records, where dodging bulls replaces vaulting, and in India's Jallikattu, where clinging to a bull's hump recalls ancient rites of passage. But the Minoans grasped something modern daredevils often miss. True ritual isn't about conquering nature, but collaborating with it. Every successful leap was a pact, a fleeting, hooved alliance between human courage and animal fury, sealed in dust and blood and wonder. Under the veil of night, when the boundary between gods and mortals grew thin, a hushed procession would wind its way to the inner sanctum of Hera's temple. There, amidst flickering torchlight and the scent of pomegranates, a priestess and priest would step forward not as themselves, but as living vessels for the divine. This was the Hieros Gamos, the sacred marriage, a ritual as old as the hills of Argos, where the union of Zeus and Hera was reenacted not in myth but in flesh and breath. To outsiders, it might have seemed scandalous, but for the initiates, this was no ordinary coupling. It was a cosmic act, a spell woven in human form to ensure the earth's fertility, the city's prosperity, and the very order of the seasons. The ceremony's roots ran deep into the pre-Olympian past, echoing ancient Near Eastern rites where kings would ritually wed goddesses to legitimize their rule. In Greece, the practice became democratized, stripped of royal privilege but no less potent. The priestess, draped in Hera's peplos and crowned with a diadem of lilies, would recline upon a couch strewn with sacred herbs, myrtle for love, wheat for abundance. The priest, embodying Zeus, wore a mantle of storm-gray wool, his brow anointed with oil from Dodona's oracle. Their words were scripted, drawn from hymns so old their language had grown archaic, but their act was anything but performative. As they joined, the temple's Aditon, the innermost chamber, would resonate with the rhythmic clashing of cymbals, mimicking the thunder that accompanied Zeus's mythical seductions. What set this rite apart was its tangible magic. Unlike symbolic offerings, the Hieros Gamos was believed to directly channel divine energy. The couple's climax wasn't private, it was communal, its power radiating outward like ripples in a pond. Farmers timed their plantings to coincide with the ritual, certain the earth would respond with doubled vigor. Childless women would press amulets to the temple walls, trusting the sacred echoes to quicken their wombs. Even the timing was precise, often performed in early spring or during the height of summer, aligning with Hera's festivals when the goddess's presence was strongest. But peel back the layers and the ritual reveals darker undercurrents. Some sources hint at a brutal truth: the priestesses may not have always been willing participants. A fragment from Pausanias mentions a girl chosen for her unblemished beauty who vanished after the rite, sparking whispers of sacrificial overtones. Other accounts describe priestesses serving for fixed terms, their bodies treated as communal property during certain festivals. The line between veneration and exploitation blurred under the weight of tradition, leaving modern scholars to grapple with uncomfortable questions. Was the Hieros Gamos an act of empowerment, or merely another thread in the tapestry of institutionalized control? Archaeology offers tantalizing clues. At Samos, terracotta figurines depict couples entwined on couches, their faces serene, perhaps votives left by those who'd benefited from the ritual's grace. In Argos, a stone lekane ritual basin bears inscriptions thanking Hera for opening the womb, its surface worn smooth by centuries of anointing oils. Yet the most poignant evidence comes from unexpected places. lead curse tablets found in Corinth, where jealous lovers begged the gods to bind rivals who participated in the rite, fearing their sacred allure. The Hieros Gomos wasn't just about fertility, it was about balance. In a world where Zeus's countless affairs threatened Hera's dignity, the ritual restored equilibrium, reminding worshippers that divine harmony required both storm and sky. The priestess's moans weren't merely human, they were the earth itself crying out for rain. The priest's exertions weren't his own, but the thunderbolts' dance across the horizon. And when the rite was done, the couple would emerge not as individuals, but as living proof that God still walked among mortals, if only for a night. Its legacy lingers in plain sight, from the sacred marriages of medieval alchemists to the maypole dances of European folklore. The idea that human unions could shape the cosmos never truly faded. Even today, when brides toss bouquets or couples leap over brooms, they're unknowingly echoing a truth the Greeks understood too well. Love isn't just a feeling. It's a force, one that can bind heaven and earth if only we dare to wield it. The chalice passed from hand to trembling hand, its dark contents catching the torchlight like liquid garnet. To an outsider, it might have looked like wine, but the initiates knew better. This was the blood of Zagreus, the divine child torn apart by titans, and to drink it was to partake in the oldest crime and the holiest of redemptions. In the dim caves where Orphic devotees gathered, this ritual wasn't just remembrance, it was reenactment, a moment where myth bled into reality with every sip. The story behind the rite was as gruesome as it was transformative. According to Orphic hymns, the infant god Dionysius Zagreus, son of Zeus and Persephone, was lured by the Titans with toys and mirrors, then dismembered and devoured. Only his heart remained, saved by Athena and used to rebirth him. But the Titans' punishment became humanity's burden. When Zeus struck them down with lightning, their ashes birthed the first humans, forever stained with both divine essence and primal sin. The blood-drinking ritual replayed this paradox, ingesting the god's essence to cleanse the Titan residue within. Archaeology suggests these rites walked a razor's edge between symbolism and literalism. Excavated cult vessels from Olbia bear inscriptions linking wine to Dionysus' blood, while bone remnants at Macedonian sites hint at occasional use of actual animal blood, perhaps from goats or bulls, creatures sacred to the god. The initiates' experience would have been visceral. The metallic tang on their tongues, the warmth of the liquid, the collective shudder as they swallowed what they believed was the very life force of a dismembered deity. This wasn't passive worship, it was communion in the truest, most unsettling sense. What makes this practice especially chilling are its eerie parallels to later Christian Eucharist rites. Early church fathers like Clement of Alexandria accused Orphic cults of demonic mimicry, but the timeline suggests the opposite, that Christianity adapted a much older idea of divine cannibalism. Both traditions share core elements, consuming the god's flesh and blood to absorb his power, the belief that this act bridges mortal and divine, even the use of wine as a stand-in for blood. The difference lay in framing. For Christians, the Eucharist was an act of salvation. For Orphics, it was also an act of atonement, a way to purify the Titan taint in their veins. Modern psychology offers a lens to understand the ritual's power. The act of drinking blood likely triggered a profound placebo effect, what anthropologists call embodied belief. The physical sensation of swallowing something taboo would have heightened initiate's sense of transformation, much like psychedelics amplify spiritual experiences today. Gold tablets buried with Orphic devotees reinforce this, bearing phrases like, "I am parched with thirst," followed by, "I have drunk from the sacred spring," a clear metaphor for the blood ritual's quenching of spiritual longing. Yet the practice wasn't without its dangers. Ancient critics describe initiates vomiting after the rite, overwhelmed by guilt or the sheer weight of the act. One fragmentary text from Thurii warns of unworthy drinkers who succumbed to madness, their minds unable to bear the god's presence in their blood. This duality, ecstasy and terror, captures the heart of the Zagreus myth. To drink the god was to confront the monstrous within the sacred, to acknowledge that divinity and violence could spring from the same source. The legacy of these rites lingers in unexpected corners. From vampire folklore to modern horror tropes, the idea that consuming blood conveys power or curse echoes this ancient belief. But perhaps the most poignant remnant is in the wine-dark depths of every communion cup, a whisper that to be human is to hunger for the divine, even if we must swallow our own shadows to reach it. Barefoot and laughing beneath the midsummer moon, women of Athens carried baskets of phallic-shaped cakes through the sacred grove, their voices ringing with jokes so crude they would make a satyr blush. This was the aretaphoria, a fertility rite where obscenity wasn't just allowed, it was sacred duty. The more outrageous the jest, the more potent the magic, as if the very air trembled with the weight of Demeter's laughter. What began as whispers between married women soon erupted into raucous choruses, each bawdy punchline another stitch in the fabric of next year's harvest. At first glance, the ritual seems shockingly out of place in austere Greek religion, but the logic was ancient. Just as seeds must break open in darkness to sprout, so too must social boundaries crack to release life's generative force. The cakes they carried, shaped like genitals and womb symbols, weren't mere props. They were edible spells, consumed in a carnivalesque atmosphere where every taboo shattered was believed to echo in the earth's fecundity. Aristophanes' Lysistrata hints at these rites when the women swear to plant leather phalluses. If men won't make peace, a comic nod to real agrarian magic. The power lay in inversion. For one night, proper matrons became purveyors of ribaldry, their humor weaponized against barrenness. A surviving fragment from the rites describes women mocking male impotence, joking about oversized vegetables, and even pantomiming lewd acts with the cakes, all under the watchful eyes of priestesses who judged not their morals but their audacity. This wasn't mere frivolity, it was sympathetic magic at its most visceral. By mimicking the unbridled fertility of nature, they sought to awaken it. Even the ritual's name whispered of secrets. Aretaphoria likely derives from areta, meaning things unspoken. Archaeology confirms the practice's ubiquity. Excavations at Eleusis revealed terracotta figurines of women holding exaggerated genitalia, their faces caught mid-laugh. Vase paintings show processions where participants brandish oversized phalloi while others collapse in giggles. Most telling are the remains of the cakes themselves, carbonized wheat molds found in sanctuary hearths, their unmistakable shapes leaving little doubt about their symbolic purpose. Modern parallels abound, from Japanese Honen Matsuri festivals with their giant wooden phalluses to Balkan bridal rituals where guests shout obscenities to ward off evil. The link between vulgarity and fertility persists. But the aretaphoria went further. It acknowledged a truth still uncomfortable today, that life springs from forces both beautiful and messy, sacred and scandalous. When those women laughed into the night, they weren't just breaking taboos, they were reminding the gods and themselves that creation is never polite. The masks weren't just disguises, they were skins of the divine, pulled over trembling human faces like a second layer of destiny. In the torchlit caverns of Cretan initiation rites, a young man would kneel, his breath ragged as the priest pressed the heavy, hollowed-out skull of a bull over his head. The weight was immediate, the eye sockets narrowing his vision to slits, the horns extending his silhouette into something monstrous. For that moment, he was no longer himself. He was the beast, the god, the raw force of nature until the mask was torn away, and with it, the last remnants of his old identity. This was the heart of masked rebirth ceremonies, where animal disguises weren't costumes but coffins for the ego, shattered so the true self could emerge. Archaeology offers haunting glimpses of these transformations. At the sanctuary of Mount Juctas, terracotta masks with gaping maws and spiraling horns lie stacked like discarded faces, their paint still vivid after millennia. Some bear deliberate cracks ritually killed after use, their power too volatile to reuse. Vase paintings from Eleusis show initiates mid-ceremony, their human bodies crowned with the heads of stags or birds, frozen in the act of dancing toward some unseen horizon. The symbolism was deliberate. To wear the mask was to die as a mortal and awaken as something liminal, neither fully human nor beast, but a bridge between worlds. The rituals followed a brutal choreography. After days of fasting and purifications, the initiate would be led blindfolded into a chamber reeking of damp earth and burnt herbs. Their hands, whether human or divine, they could never be sure, would clasp the mask over their features, its interior often lined with herbs like henbane or laurel to induce visions. Ancient texts describe the moment of transformation as a sensory overload. The scrape of antlers against stone, the muffled drone of chants, the metallic taste of fear and ecstasy mingling on the tongue. Then the violence of unmasking, sometimes literal, as priests yanked the disguise free with enough force to bruise, mimicking the pain of rebirth. What makes these rites so fascinating is their universality. From the bull-masked dancers of Knossos to the bird-headed figures in Samothrace's mysteries, the same motif recurs. To become sacred, one must first become inhuman. A gold tablet from Pelina instructs the dead to declare, "I am a child of earth and starry heaven, but my race is of the gods," suggesting the masks were tools to manifest this dual nature. Even the materials held meaning. Bull masks were often actual skulls, their hollow cavities amplifying the wearer's voice into a booming, otherworldly growl. Bird masks crafted from raven or owl feathers allowed the wearer to fly symbolically, their chants becoming winged messengers to the gods. The psychological impact would have been profound. Modern studies on ritual masking show how concealing the face can trigger dissociative states, easing the absorption of new identities. For the Greeks, this wasn't just psychology, it was metaphysics. To dance in the guise of a bull was to channel its brute strength. To don the visage of a bird was to glimpse the afterlife from above. When the mask finally fell, the initiate wasn't simply returning to humanity. They were carrying something back, a flicker of the divine, lodged in the marrow like a shard of broken horn. Yet the masks also held a darker lesson. Many were deliberately grotesque, with lolling tongues or bulging eyes, reflecting the Greeks' understanding that divinity isn't always beautiful. To stand before the gods meant facing the monstrous within oneself, the animal impulses and hungers that civilization tries to bury. In that dim space between mask and skin, between death and rebirth, initiates learned a truth we still grapple with today. That transformation isn't just about gaining, it's about surrendering. And sometimes, to become who you're meant to be, you must first let the beast wear your face. The wooden box sat at the center of the sanctuary, its surface worn smooth by centuries of reverent touches, yet never opened outside the appointed hour. This was the kist, a deceptively simple container that held the most potent secrets of Greek mystery cults, its contents so sacred that even mentioning them outside initiation risked divine wrath. Imagine the weight of that moment, the hushed anticipation as the priest's fingers brushed the latch, the creak of aged hinges revealing objects that bridge the human and divine. To the uninitiated, it might have looked like a chest of curiosities, perhaps a dried pomegranate, a handful of weathered bones, or an oddly shaped lump wrapped in linen. But to those who understood, these were not mere relics. They were conduits pulsing with the same energy that once coursed through the veins of gods. Ancient texts tease us with fragments about these cryptic containers. Clement of Alexandria, ever the provocateur, claimed the Eleusinian kist held a serpent, a phallus, and the things that Demeter mourned, likely seeds or poppies symbolizing Persephone's descent. Meanwhile, Apuleius' golden ass describes Isiac initiates unveiling a golden kist containing objects too holy to name, their revelation causing the protagonist to tremble as if struck by lightning. The descriptions share a common thread. These weren't passive symbols but active participants in the ritual. A phallus might be anointed with oil and passed among initiates to channel Dionysian fertility, while bones, possibly those of Orphic heroes, could be pressed against foreheads to transfer ancestral wisdom. The power of the kist lay in its paradox, concealment as revelation. By keeping its contents hidden except during specific rites, the cults weaponized anticipation. Days or even weeks of purification led to this single moment when the box's opening coincided with the initiate's psychological peak, imprinting its contents with transcendent weight. A 2nd century inscription from Samothrace hints at this orchestration, praising the gods for revealing the kist when the soul was ripe. Modern neuroscience offers insight. The brain assigns heightened significance to rare, emotionally charged stimuli. That fleeting glimpse of a consecrated object during an altered state could brand itself onto memory like a divine seal. Archaeology adds tantalizing clues and contradictions. Excavations at Lycosaura unearthed a terracotta kist with small holes, suggesting live creatures, snakes, beetles, were temporarily housed inside. Another from Thebes contained a hollow ceramic phallus filled with lead tablets inscribed with curses, blurring the line between worship and magic. Most intriguing are the so-called kistophoroi figurines from Pergamon, depicting women carrying miniature boxes on their heads, possibly mimicking processions where the kist's journey through the city sanctified the path. Yet for all we've pieced together, the kist's greatest secret may be its emptiness. Some scholars argue the boxes were sometimes void of physical objects altogether, their true contents being the collective focus of the initiates. Like Schrödinger's cat, the kist held infinite potential until opened, a blank canvas for projection. A devotee steeped in Demeter's myths might see pomegranate seeds, a Dionysiac a vine-wrapped Theosis. The box became a mirror, reflecting back whatever the cult needed its members to behold. This duality, object and idea, full and void, explains the kist's enduring mystique. From the Ark of the Covenant to Freemasonry's sacred chests, humanity keeps returning to the power of the sealed container. The Greeks simply understood something we often forget. That mystery isn't the absence of meaning, but its crucible. When that lid finally lifted, it wasn't just a box being opened, it was the human mind. Under the silver gaze of a full moon, bare feet pounded the soft earth of Broron's sacred grove as young girls. Some no older than 7 leaped and spun in frenzied circles, their white chitons billowing like ghostly wings. These were the Arctoi, the she-bears of Artemis, performing the nocturnal dances that transformed human children into the goddess's mythical nymphs for one night each year. To witness their whirling figures in the moon-dappled clearing was to glimpse the raw, untamed energy of Artemis herself, the virgin huntress who defied gender norms, ruled the wilderness, and demanded absolute loyalty from her followers. But what began as innocent mimicry could quickly spiral into something darker, wilder. Some girls shed their tunics entirely, racing through the trees with torches like the vengeful furies. Others donned male hunting gear, their bodies becoming living paradoxes, virgins embodying masculine vigor, maidens channeling the goddess who once turned a peeping mortal into a stag for his transgression. The rituals followed an ancient cyclical logic. Just as Artemis's nymphs danced in myth to celebrate her victories or to mourn her losses, so too did their human counterparts reenact these sacred stories with startling physicality. A girl playing Callisto, the nymph turned bear by Artemis's wrath, would crouch and growl as others hunted her with wooden spears. Those embodying the doomed Iphigenia, saved by the goddess at the altar, collapsed in mock death before resurrecting to join the dance. The most striking were the androgynoi participants who cross-dressed as male hunters, their short tunics and sandals borrowed from brothers or fathers, mimicking Artemis's own rejection of feminine constraints. Vase paintings from Broron capture these moments, a girl adjusting a faux beard, another brandishing a tiny bow, her expression caught between mischief and reverence. What outsiders dismissed as childish games held profound psychological stakes. For Athenian families, dedicating a daughter as an arctos was both honor and insurance. Artemis guarded transitions between life stages, and these rituals ensured safe passage from girlhood to marriageable age. But the dances themselves were anything but docile. Ancient sources describe participants chewing ivy leaves, mildly hallucinogenic, and drinking honeyed barley water until their movements became feverish, their laughter edged with something primal. The goal wasn't pretty performance, it was ecstasis, the Greek concept of standing outside oneself. When a 10-year-old snarled like a bear or a 14-year-old knocked an arrow with male-coded precision, they weren't just playing roles. They were dissolving, however briefly, the rigid categories that governed Greek life. The archaeological record whispers of this boundary breaking further. Excavations at Broron's sanctuary revealed piles of broken crateriskoi small pots decorated with scenes of girls racing naked, smashed intentionally after rites, perhaps to symbolize shattered social norms. Even more telling are the carved reliefs showing men watching from the grove's edges, their faces a mix of fascination and unease. Artemis's dances were one of the few sanctioned spaces where female bodies moved unchecked by male scrutiny, where the moon's light granted temporary immunity from patriarchal order. Modern parallels flicker at the edges of this ancient practice. From the ecstatic dances of Sufi mystics to the masked Moro-Moro festivals of the Philippines, humans still use movement to transcend identity. But Artemis's moonlit rites carried a sharper edge. These weren't just celebrations of femininity, they were rehearsals for rebellion. When those girls smeared their faces with ash and howled at the sky, they weren't merely honoring a goddess. They were remembering in their bones that divinity has claws, and so, just maybe, could they. In the hushed darkness of underground sanctuaries, initiates weren't just preparing for life, they were training for death. Among the most profound practices of Greek mystery cults was the art of soul guidance, where members learned to navigate the treacherous landscape of the afterlife like seasoned travelers memorizing a roadmap. These psychopomp rituals, named after Hermes Psychopompos, the god who shepherded souls to the underworld, weren't abstract teachings. They were survival tactics, equipping devotees with sacred passwords, coded gestures, and even physical tokens to outwit the divine gatekeepers standing between them and eternal bliss. Imagine clutching a thin gold leaf inscribed with strange phrases as your lifeless body was laid to rest. This wasn't jewelry, it was a cheat sheet for the afterlife. Archaeologists have unearthed dozens of these tablets from graves across Magna Graecia, their tiny letters whispering instructions. When you reach the spring of Mnemosyne, tell the guardians, I am a child of earth and starry heaven. My name is Asterios, and I thirst for the waters of memory. Fail the test, and your soul would be forced to drink from Lethe, the river of forgetting, doomed to wander in oblivion. But recite the right words, and the gates would swing open, revealing the Elysian fields bathed in golden light. The parallels to Egypt's Book of the Dead are striking. Both traditions shared a belief that knowledge was the ultimate currency in the afterlife. Just as Egyptian spells guided souls past the 42 judges of Mad, Greek passwords offered safe passage past Persephone's sentinels, but there was a crucial difference. Where Egyptian texts were often standardized, the Greek approach was deeply personal. Initiates didn't just memorize phrases, they underwent simulated journeys in hidden crypts where masked Priest's Chinese letter D underworld deities demanding proof of worthiness. A surviving fresco from a Campanian tomb shows this vividly. An initiate standing before a painted Hades, their hand raised in the mystico symbolon, a secret hand gesture said to unlock the god's throne room. The genius of these rituals lay in their psychological precision. By rehearsing death repeatedly, initiates stripped it of its terror. Those who'd died symbolically in underground chambers who'd whispered passwords to actors playing Cerberus could face the real thing with eerie calm. Even the tokens buried with them, a coin for Charon, a honey cake for Cerberus, weren't just superstitious trinkets. They were physical anchors for the soul, tactile reminders of the unseen roadmap they'd spent years memorizing. Modern near-death experiences echo this ancient wisdom. Many report encounters with gatekeepers or the need to demonstrate moral readiness, suggesting the mystery cults tapped into something fundamental about human consciousness. But the Greeks took it further. For them, the afterlife wasn't a passive judgment, it was an obstacle course where training mattered more than virtue. The gold leaves make this explicit. One from Thessaly bluntly states, "Even a good man remains trapped without the words." What makes these practices so poignant is their intimacy. Unlike grand temple ceremonies, psychopomp training happened in whispers between mentor and student, parent and child. A 4th century vase shows a woman slipping a gold tablet into her husband's shroud, her face a mask of grief and determination. She wasn't just burying a spouse, she was equipping a traveler, because in the end, the mystery cults understood something we still struggle with today, that death is the ultimate journey. And like any great odyssey, it's safer when you know the way. Bare feet met glowing embers as the procession wound its way across the fire pit, the air shimmering with heat and devotion. This was the sacred firewalk of the Hephaestus cults, where proving one's faith meant literally walking through flames unscathed. The ritual began at dusk when priests stoked a pyre of olive wood and grapevines, materials sacred to the smith god, until it collapsed into a bed of searing coals. Initiates, their ankles adorned with bronze rings mimicking the god's lameness, would fast for 3 days before stepping onto the embers, their faces illuminated by the pulsating glow beneath them. The crowd held its breath as each footfall sent up sparks like miniature offerings to the forge god himself. What looks like madness to modern eyes was, for the ancients, a carefully calculated act of sacred physics. The key lay in the preparation. Ember beds were raked to eliminate lingering flames, creating an even layer of low-density coals that transferred heat slowly. Walkers moved briskly but deliberately, their feet coated in herbal pastes of sage and clay substances we now know contain heat-resistant silica compounds. Most crucially, they stepped lightly, minimizing contact time through practiced dancing steps. Far from reckless bravery, this was ritualized thermodynamics disguised as miracle working. The psychological component ran even deeper. Hephaestus, the limping god rejected by Olympus, was the patron of outsiders and craftsmen. Walking his fires wasn't just about endurance, it was about transformation. Surviving the coals meant embodying the god's own journey from castaway to creator. Success conferred status. Blacksmiths who completed the walk earned the right to stamp their wares with Hephaestus' symbol, while wounded soldiers saw it as spiritual rehabilitation. A votive offering from Lemnos shows a bearded smith mid-stride across flames, his workshop tools dangling from a belt, a snapshot of occupational devotion made literal. Remarkably, these rites never fully died out. In modern Greece, fire-walking ceremonies still erupt annually in villages like Langodas and Aya Eleni, now syncretized with Christian saints but retaining their volcanic pagan heart. Participants called anastenarides enter trance states while clutching icons, their bare feet dancing across coals that still reach 700 degrees Celsius. Scientists who have studied them note the same techniques used millennia ago. Short, quick steps, ember preparation, and the power of collective belief lowering pain perception. When the village priest sprinkles water to cool the coals, he's performing the same theater of the divine that Hephaestus priests once did, blurring the line between faith and physics. The true miracle isn't that people walked on fire, it's that the ritual walked through time, carrying with it the echo of hammers on bronze and the scent of sacred forges. Every footstep across those coals, ancient or modern, leaves the same message. Some devotions are too fierce to be extinguished. The air in the telesterion grew thick with anticipation, the scent of torch smoke and myrrh pressing against the initiate's skin as they knelt in the darkness. After days of fasting, purifications, and the nerve-shredding Brimo rites, this was the moment that would define their entire journey, the epopteia, the final seeing. Without warning, a deafening gong shattered the silence, and suddenly the chamber erupted in blinding golden light. Through their tear-filled eyes, the initiates glimpsed it, a single ear of wheat held aloft by the Hierophant, its kernels glowing as if lit from within. This was no ordinary grain. According to the hymns, it was the same stock Demeter clutched when she mourned Persephone, a living relic of the goddess's grief and renewal. Some claimed it shimmered with otherworldly energy, others swore it pulsed like a heartbeat in the priest's hands. But one thing was certain in that searing instant: the boundary between mortal and divine didn't just blur, it burned away entirely. What made this moment so transformative wasn't just the spectacle, but the precision of its staging. The telesterion's architecture amplified the revelation. Its roof had a hidden aperture that, when uncovered at dawn or dusk, allowed a single shaft of sunlight to strike the Hierophant's raised object like a celestial spotlight. The effect was engineered transcendence. The sudden contrast between hours of darkness and this explosive radiance triggered optic flares in the initiate's vision, making the grain appear to dance with ethereal fire. Modern studies on sensory deprivation confirm this phenomenon after prolonged darkness. Even mundane objects viewed in abrupt light can provoke hallucinations of luminescence. The Hierophants of Eleusis weren't just priests, they were master manipulators of human perception, wielding biology as deftly as theology. The grain itself was a masterstroke of symbolic ambiguity. Was it simply a husk of wheat, or, as the later Christian critic Hippolytus sneered, a phallus of the god? Porphyry insisted initiates saw a giant mushroom, hinting at ergot-infected barley fueling their visions. The truth likely resided in the cult's genius for multiplicity. For farmers, it represented agricultural cycles. For mothers, Persephone's return from Hades. For philosophers, the seed of the soul's immortality. This polysemy was intentional. By never settling on one interpretation, the epopteia became a mirror. Each initiate projected their own yearning onto that radiant stalk, seeing in its glow the answers they most needed. Archaeology hints at the revelation's aftermath. Excavations at Eleusis revealed terracotta votives shaped like wheat ears, many charred as if exposed to intense heat, possibly ritual burnings mimicking the epopteia's divine fire. Even more telling are the accounts of initiates post-ritual. Plato's metaphor of the soul's wings regrowing in the Phaedrus likely riffed on Eleusinian imagery, while Cicero claimed nothing in Greek civilization surpassed the mystery's power to live with joy and die with hope. The grain wasn't just seen, it was internalized, its light transplanted into the psyche. But the epopteia's greatest secret may have been its impermanence. Unlike idols locked in temples, the sacred object vanished after the rite, never displayed again until the next initiation. This transient holiness forced a revelation. The divine wasn't trapped in relics, but in the act of witnessing itself. The grain wasn't magic because it glowed because for one breathless instant everyone believed it could. In that collective suspension of disbelief, amid the drumbeats and the dazzled tears, the real mystery wasn't the object. It was the light it cast, not just on the wheat, but on the faces of those who finally understood. The lifeless body lay on the bier, its pale eyelids weighted down by 2 weathered bronze coins, not placed there by mourners but by necessity. This was the toll for Charon, the skeletal ferryman who rowed souls across the rivers of the underworld, and without payment, the dead would wander the shores for eternity, lost between worlds. The practice of coin offerings to the dead wasn't just superstition. It was a spiritual transaction as vital as a heartbeat, rooted in a terrifying vision of the afterlife where poverty didn't end at death. The ritual's origins stretch back to Homer's Odyssey, where Elpena's ghost begs Odysseus to bury his body properly so he might cross the waters of sorrow. But by the classical era, this vague notion had hardened into dogma. Every Greek knew the rules: a single obol, the cheapest denomination, placed in the mouth or over the eyes, guaranteed passage. Wealthy families often splurged, tucking gold coins beneath the tongue or scattering them around the corpse like a macabre dowry. Some tombs even contained miniature coins for children, their tiny faces pressed into the metal as if death itself had to accommodate innocence. Archaeology reveals how deeply this belief permeated society. Excavated graves from Sicily to the Black Sea yield coins blackened by funeral pyres or grooved from teeth, evidence they'd been clenched in jaws before cremation. At Poseidonia, a warrior's skeleton was found with a silver drachma fused to its skull, the heat of his pyre welding payment to bone. But the most haunting finds are the unpaid burials, graves with no coins, their occupants perhaps deliberately condemned to eternal limbo as punishment for crimes or sacrilege. The symbolism ran deeper than mere payment. Coins carried images of city-states' patron gods: Athena's owl on Athenian drachmas, Poseidon's trident on Corinth staters, turning each obol into a divine passport. Their weight on the eyes also served a practical function, keeping lids shut against the evil eye, ensuring the dead couldn't return to haunt the living. In some regions, coins were pierced and threaded onto burial shrouds like spiritual armor, warding off underworld demons, yet the practice had its skeptics. Philosophers like Diogenes mocked it, demanding his disciples bury him coinless. Do you think Hades has toll booths? But even cynics often complied, pressured by families fearing supernatural consequences. The terror of a restless, unferried ghost outweighed any philosophical doubts. Modern echoes of this ritual linger in pennies left on gravestones and the phrase, "a penny for your thoughts," originally a nod to paying the dead for wisdom. But the Greeks understood something we've forgotten, that death isn't free, and even souls need loose change for the journey. Every coin pressed onto those cold eyelids was a hope, not just for safe passage, but for the cruel mercy of being truly, finally gone. The handshake began like any other, a clasp of palms, warm and firm. But then came the twist, a subtle pressure from the little finger curling inward to brush the wrist in 3 quick taps. To an outsider, it was just an odd quirk, but to the initiated, that silent signal meant everything. This was the synthema, the secret handshake of Greek mystery cults, a coded gesture so closely guarded that revealing it could mean execution. Imagine the stakes. In a world where divine knowledge was currency, these clandestine rituals separated the worthy from the unworthy, the insiders from the interlopers, with life or death precision. The synthema wasn't just a greeting, it was a living cipher. Some involved intricate finger placements like the Eleusinian variant, where the thumb hooked under the ring finger to form a sacred knot, symbolizing the bond between Demeter and Persephone. Others incorporated whispered phrases, fragments of hymns so obscure that only those who'd endured years of initiation would recognize them. A Spartan initiate might murmur, "I have fasted, I have drunk the Kykeon," while his counterpart in Samothrace would press their forehead to another's and breathe, "The Kabiri have seen you." These weren't passwords, they were litmus tests for the soul, designed to expose imposters through hesitation or a misplaced syllable. Archaeology offers tantalizing glimpses of this covert language. A fresco from Herculaneum shows 2 men gripping forearms, their thumbs aligned in a way that mirrors descriptions of Mithraic handshakes. Votive reliefs from Eleusis depict initiates with hands clasped in unnatural configurations, frozen in stone as if mid-ritual. The most chilling evidence comes from a court record in Athens, where a man was executed for teaching the synthema of the great gods of Samothrace to a Roman spy, proof that these gestures carried the weight of treason. But why such extreme secrecy? The answer lies in the cult's view of knowledge as a ladder to the divine. Unlike public religion, where rituals were open to all, mystery traditions thrived on exclusivity. The synthema wasn't just about identification, it was a metaphysical key believed to unlock doors in the afterlife. Gold tablets buried with initiates instruct them to perform the gestures before Persephone's throne, suggesting the handshakes were rehearsals for the soul's final journey. A misstep in the underworld could mean eternal wandering, so precision wasn't just protocol, it was salvation. The synthema's legacy slithers into modernity. Freemasonry's grip and grind handshakes, the coded taps of resistance groups, even the elaborate hand games of children, all echo these ancient rites of recognition. But what's lost in translation is the sacred terror that once accompanied them. To know the synthema was to hold a fragment of the god's own language. And in a world where divinity and danger were two sides of the same coin, that knowledge wasn't just power, it was a pact. One wrong move, one loosened tongue, and the very hands that clasped yours in brotherhood might just become the ones that dragged you to the executioner's block. From consuming hallucinogenic brews that dissolved the veil between worlds to dancing in frenzied ecstasy until consciousness shattered, the mystery cults of ancient Greece explored the outermost edges of what it means to be human. We've witnessed initiates crushing eggs as cosmic metaphors, binding themselves in sacred knots only to be violently freed, and whispering secret names that could summon gods. We've watched them leap over bulls as if gravity were optional, press rotting pig flesh into farmland like alchemists of decay, and walk barefoot across glowing coals without flinching. These weren't mere eccentricities, they were carefully engineered attempts to solve the fundamental riddles of existence. How do we confront mortality? Channel divine energy, forge bonds stronger than blood. What's striking isn't just the strangeness of these rituals, but the universality of the needs they addressed. The Pharmako's scapegoat ritual transformed collective guilt into catharsis. The sacred marriage rites mirrored our endless dance between chaos and order. Even something as simple as placing coins on a corpse's eyelids speaks to a fear as old as time, the terror of being stranded between worlds, unfinished and unseen. These cults thrived because they offered what official religion couldn't: visceral, personal encounters with the numinous. In a world without therapy, they pioneered trauma release through bull leaping and brimo trials. Before neuroscience, they hacked trance states with drumbeats and darkness. Their strangeness was simply the price of admission to realms beyond ordinary perception. So here's the real question lurking behind all these rituals: which one would you dare to try? Could you swallow the blood of Zagreus, knowing it might rewrite your soul? Would you let a serpent slither down your tunic as the priest of Sabazios demanded? Or might you stand before the omphalos, palms pressed to the navel of the world, waiting for the stone to whisper back? The mystery cults may be dust now, but the longings they fed still pulse in us for transformation, for belonging, for proof that magic isn't dead. And maybe that's the final secret they left behind. The rituals were never about the gods at all. They were about us, raw, trembling, and endlessly hungry for the moment when the veil finally tears. If these ancient practices ignited your curiosity, let me know in the comments which one resonated or terrified you the most. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's hidden corners, where the past isn't just preserved, it's alive.